Hi there, and welcome to the live action CG render layers Maya DVD. We're going to go over how to put together a shot from beginning to end, from shooting to tracking to compositing, basically all the way straight through. So let's get started here. This is the footage we shot with. It's HVX 200 camera. It's a progressive 24p HD camera that shoots 1280 by 720. Higher end cameras can shoot 1920 by 1080, and now of course we've got the red that is just been released, and that thing can go up to like 4K. So we're really getting into the realm of HD footage, getting into the hands of indie filmmakers and so forth, which is really awesome. So this DVD covers how to incorporate live action CG and really make it as real as you can possibly create it. This may not be as advanced as Industrial Lights and Magic or Digital Domain, but I think it's a great start to build off of. As you can see in this footage, we're going to incorporate in this alleyway a mail truck. And this mail truck was created by a student of mine named Jared Thabew. Go to www.jaredthabew.com. He's got a website. He's currently looking for work, so I recommend you take a look at his reel. Great student, one of my best. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Close this. Now, one thing we got to understand is on your DVD, you have a folder called Tracked, where you're going to dump that folder under your C drive, just so that all reference files line up. And there's really only one. It's like the mailbox one, I believe. And inside this folder is a lot where we're going to be working a lot of our files here. We have Dark Alley Pan and Passes. Passes is where we have all of the different render layer passes already rendered out for you, so you don't have to sit there and render out the images. So if we go to Dark Alley Pan, here's that breakdown video we just watched. There's part 1 and 2. Part 1 is going to consist of a lot of the Buju stuff and getting your camera properly orientated. A lot of people, when they track stuff in Buju, they usually orientated it in Buju, and I find Buju to be, it's a great orientation program, but I prefer to do the orientation in Maya. So we're going to go over that, and then part 2 goes over the render layers and how we separate each little piece for each different render layer for the mail truck itself. And here's the actual target file, which is just the diffuse pass. It's pretty simple. Under shader plugin demos, these are demo versions of things you can also get online. Real Smart Motion Blur is what we're going to be using. Here's the installation process. If you for some reason lose this DVD or lose the information or whatever, you can go to visioneffects.com, or I'm sorry, revisioneffects.com, and they have this this great plugin. It's called Real Smart Motion Blur. And the one we're looking at here is the Pro version. It's $149.95 as of today, and it's a great plugin. It's important that you get the Pro version because then it has the vector plugin, and that's the plugin we're going to be using. So without a doubt, this is very, very important that you get this plugin and not the regular version and so forth. It's $150, but like I said, it's the best $150 you can ever spend. So I recommend that after you install this demo version, which will render with an X on your screen, that you go ahead and buy it and get the code to get it working. You'll find it to be essentially, very, very important to your productions because it handles the motion blur in post, and that's what we're going to be doing. So if we go back here, we've got Vector Motion Blur, which works hand in hand with Real Smart Motion Blur. This is a free Mental Ray plugin online. Just keyword search LM2DMV version 2 just to get more information on it. The instructions are right here. It says right here that you're going to have to find your Maya Ray RC file and drop this in there. So I'm going to go ahead and show you where that's at. So you're going to go under C, Program Files, Autodesk Maya 8.5 Mental Ray, and you'll find Maya Ray RC. So I'm going to open this up with Notepad and come down, and as you can see right here, I've already added it. See, I've added another one here for controlled occlusion, which you can find more about in myrentalray.com. So you're just basically copying this information right here onto the startup menu for your mental ray. And then you just save it. So then you would hit File, Save. Okay. So with that, you also have some other instructions here. There's two files in here that you'll have to move. One is the MEL file, and then the MI file, and then the DLL file. And there's instructions on where those are placed. They're usually put in include in the library file. So go ahead and read the instructions, and it shows you where to drop those files. So I'm not going to go too much into that. And now we're going to test to make sure that the LM2DMV shader is working. So I'm in Maya. I'm going to go to my Hypershade, and I'm going to go to my create mental ray nodes. If I'm in Maya nodes, it's usually what you start out with. You want to do create mental ray nodes, and you come under material, come down. See, here's my control occlusion I showed you earlier. Then you'll find this thing LM2DMV version 2. You might not have an icon on yours if you don't, you haven't put the icon file there. And you can double click that. You can see right here we've set it up to real smart motion blur vectors, normalize 128. This we'll go over later, but just make sure it's working, it's there, and we're all set. So we're going to go ahead and jump over to Buju and track the plate footage. All right, we're moving on to part 2. Tracking is interesting in regards to getting your image into a tracking program. You can use Final Cut Pro, Premiere, and do File, Export, Image Sequence, and you'll get an image sequence off of your timeline. I recommend shooting 24p and then having a 24p timeline. But it also imports the same way back in. But we have to work in image sequences here. We can't work in just like a movie file or an AVI. So you have to export your information in image sequences so it gets single frames. Motion tracking software, some range from price. Buju I find to be the best. There's PF Tracker, another big industry standard. Match Mover Pro. Synthize, and then there's Maya Live, which I would not recommend. But all of these are really great. They all have different types of algorithms. Certain people have been at it a longer time, and I've seen their algorithms work a lot better on most shots. But we're going to go with the Buju. We have a demo version of Buju 4 up, which you can also download at 2d3.com. And I'm going to go through a basic introduction of how you track stuff. We can't export cameras out of this, but we have an exported camera that we created through a plugin called Muju, which is also which actually has I believe it's a 15-day trial offer, which works within Maya. It's sort of like Buju in Maya. And there's other great products of different price ranges if you go to 2d3.com, like Buju Bullet and so forth. So definitely check them out. So I'll hit no. Here is Buju. It looks kind of daunting at first, but it's actually very, very simple. It's not hard at all. I'm going to go ahead and hit Import Sequence, and I'm going to go ahead and go under C. I'm going to go under Tracked, and then I'm going to go under Dark Alley Pan. Oops, go up one. Passes, and I'm going to find my plate shot. So here's my plate shot, and I'm going to go ahead and see what I got here. So I'm going to choose the first frame. Now, just for your luck, I don't have a frame number 1 on any of these renders. Don't ask me why, it just ended that way. So I'm going to hit 2, and then I'm going to hit Open. And as you can see here, it already calculated frame number 2 starting and end frame 81. Figured out non-interlaced. This actually does an auto-interlacing for you if you wish. I wouldn't recommend that. This is progressive footage, so we don't have to de-interlace it. Is this a free move or is this a nodal pan? Well, it was shot on a tripod. If you did a free move where you were actually moving around, and I really do mean moving around, you literally have to be running down the street to get things to track right. Free move would be recommended. Nodal pan is great for beginners. It's basically if you shot on a tripod or if you kind of stayed in a single area and you just panned around. You don't have to be right on a tripod, but it's always good to be, attached to something if you're going to do a nodal pan. This shot is a nodal pan, so we're going to leave it at that. And I'm going to hit OK. And give it a few seconds here, and the footage pops up. So here's the footage. We're going to go all the way through. And it's already in there. Whoop-de-whoop-de-doo. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is if we had a person running around our scene and we didn't want the camera to pick up on that, we don't want the computer to track it, we can do this add poly mask. This is a clean plate, there's nobody in the shot, but if a person was running by, I might want to mask them. This is all done through an animated mask, so I can add poly mask. And you don't have to be perfect on this. I can, bring it over here, go like that, see how it animates. And I can animate a person. Of course, they're probably going to get smaller or something, so I can animate these down. So you can see how this animates. So just it's really, really fast. It's not a lot of work, but just try to hide anything that's moving around. Buju does a good job of finding out what's not supposed to be tracked anyway. But it's always good for better calculations to mask out anything that that you don't want in your shot. So if I go under, let's see, I got to pull that sucker out. So here's masks, and I'm going to delete that mask, get rid of it. And we're going to go ahead and track the footage. So it's real simple, track features, hit that. My usual favorites are advanced, large, and sensitivity up, about 3/4 of the way. Just a personal favorite. It seems to work always better. And I'm going to hit start. As you can see, it's just tracking contrast points, real simple. This is going to calculate a lot faster. If you do a free move, it might take up to an hour, 2, 3 hours, but it knows it's on a nodal pan. And as you can see, the dots are giving the camera information. It's giving, and if you were doing a motion camera shot where you're moving into the shot, it would establish parallax by seeing where these lines are being drawn. It's as if I were to take this plate shot back here and render it black, I can look from the lines and see, oh, I see what I'm doing. I'm panning from right to left. And that's what the computer's doing. It's trying to calculate what's going on in your scene. And the more motion you have in your scene, especially for free moves, the better it'll track. It's sort of a weird, it kind of makes no sense, but the more motion you have, the better information that the computer can get, and then hence it can calculate what's going on in your scene. Running down this street with a free move render is going to calculate a lot better than just slowly walking around. Okay, so you're better off, if you're going to do any real slow walking around shots, you might want to just put it on a tripod and render it as a nodal pan instead of a free move. So after we do that, we go to camera solve, and we'll just do all frames and hit start. This stuff will take seconds. It's because it's a nodal pan. If you did a free move, it'll take a lot longer. So there you go. We've got all these little tracking dots. I can go to 3D mode, and I can hold down Shift and left mouse button and see the actual camera setup. And we're good to go. So all that's left is File, and then we go to Export, Export Camera Solve. And we're going to choose, usually the one on here is Maya 4 Plus, anything higher than Maya 4. That's it, really, and just hit save. Now, of course, this is the demo version, and we are not allowed to export the camera on here. But there you go, real simple. It's that's pretty much it. It's not hard. Now, in Hollywood, they go a little farther. They get their focal length, and they have all types of different options in here. You can calibrate your scene to match your grid in here. I prefer not to. You can, but it's up to you. We're going to do that in Maya, okay? So I'm going to close Buju here. Close anyway. And we're going to go into Maya and see what we get. So here's the Maya, here's the file itself. And if I look, I have a camera here called Buju Camera. And first off, it's kind of like way too, we're looking too far into the image, so we got to fix that. So I'm going to hit View Select Camera. And you can see it's already set up the image plane to go really, really far here. And we're going to go ahead and go under Display Options. And we already have Display Resolution on, but we want to do a little overscan here. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn on overscan. So we can go View, Camera Settings, where are you? Overscan. I'm going to click that. It's going to pop farther back, and that's a little too far for my taste. So I'm going to hold down Control left mouse drag in this actual area right here, and I'm going to adjust it to the size that I think would fit best. And instead of like working with my component editor, not with my component editor, with my channel box, I'm going to judge it from that. So I'm going to come in. That's probably bring it back right there. All right, so let's take a look at what we got so far here. I can scroll through the shot, see we're at frame 2 and we're at frame 81. What's so nice about opening up this Maya file is it already has the image sequence set up. It's already got the render global set up, which is really cool. It's got the Buju camera. It's got width 1280 by 720. It's got all these options set up for you already, which is so cool. And then all you really have to do is render through the camera. Okay. So what does this include? Let's take a look at the outliner. Well, you get the Buju data node. And that's a group of your camera and your reference points. I like having the reference points there just to know where it tracked. More along lines in a free move, you'll want to know where to put your stuff in general. But for now, I'm probably going to just hide this. So I'm going to do display, hide selection. There we go. So now what we have is the Buju data node, the camera, and the reference points. I'll just get rid of the reference points. So I have this Buju camera and then this Buju data node, this group. And there's a reason for not just having a camera, but also a group node in there. We're going to have to orientate the camera. And instead of scale, so say for instance if I had, I'll just draw out a cube here. Say I brought my camera into my scene, and here's my car, right? This is a real lame excuse for a car. So here's the car, right? And instead of taking my scene here, scaling this guy down, going into my camera here, bringing him in the shot, rotating him off of what is the grid, and saying, okay, that looks good. No, I got to scale it down. And I got to do this. And I got to do this. And play back the footage and go, oh, that looks good. I'm going to do a different way of doing this, and that's to work around it by actually scaling the camera to the actual scene instead of scaling the scene to the actual camera. Okay, so that's what this group node is I can actually take this group, I can scale it, I can move it around. The camera motion is still playing through. Okay, so here's it way down here, right? If I look through the camera on this, it's still playing through, still perfectly fine. So that's what the purpose of that group node is so you can offset orientate the camera itself to be in an alignment with XYZ coordinates of your grid. Okay, so what do we do then? Well, what I was going to do before is I just create a cube, and I'll put that cube somewhere like down here. And maybe scale it up. So first thing you do is create a cube. Make sure it's kind of in the direction of the camera. I'm going to look through the Buju camera node, and I'm just going to orientate this the best I can using the world area here, usually this area, and just bring it up. That. It's good to also grab the middle joint, move it around, see how the perspective of the camera works out. See if it's working. And then I'm going to go click on translation, and I'm going to choose local mode is there, so I'm going to go object mode. I'm going to move down and see does this look like it could be plausibly a truck going down the street here? And that looks about right. Maybe want to do a little tweaking here and so forth. Now after I do that, we're going to go into our outliner here. I'm going to take this cube, I'm going to middle mouse drag it into the group node of the Buju group node. Okay? This is very tricky, so I recommend you pay attention here. I'm going to take this group node, not the camera node, not the cube, but the group node, Buju data group node. I'm going to hit insert, and I'm going to make the pivot point with my snap to vertex. I'm going to snap that to one of the point ends of the cube. and hit insert. So once again, it's this group node's pivot point, which I change by hitting insert. Now, what basically that means is I can orientate this all I want, okay, and the animation still stays the same. See that? Point it up. Animation still staying the same. Camera didn't get knocked off its, its animation. It's all relative to the box itself, to the group node. So what I usually do is I go to my side view now, and I'm just going to start orientating this as best as I can, nudging it like that, and use this outside circle here to rotate it. And I'm orientating the group node, not the camera, not the cube, the group node. And I'll go to front view, and there's front view, and I'll just kind of line that up perfectly so I don't get no jaggies along the top edge here. I'm basically lining it up with the grid. See how I'm doing that? So if I look in the front view, I'm looking perfectly straight on to the square, to the grid. Same thing from the top view. See how it's lining up with the grid itself? Got it? And then front view, side view. It's looking pretty good. I think we got it. It might not be perfect, but hey. So, and then I go to perspective mode, and I'll just hit my translation. And this is where I'm going to slip out of, I'll go into world view, world mode for translate. And I'm going to move this, okay, over here. Now if I had a car here, I could start scaling up my camera. So it's a matter of orientating your camera, getting it in the general area, because I'm going to create a lot of stuff at the origin. I don't want to have this thing way out here, but I want it over here. And I know that this area under the box is the ground, so I'm going to line that up with the grid. See that? There you go. Now, if I need to scale, let's say my car is like this size, that's when I would start scaling it up. And because I have my pivot point at the bottom here, it's going to scale up nice and uniformly and not move off of the ground. So I can scale, 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 depending on the size of my scene. Now, if I start getting this, that means I got to hit View Select Camera on my perspective camera, and I got to get my clip-in plane working. So clip-in plane, I'll set that up to some ridiculous number. Here we go, moving around the scene. We're all set. One last option you can do for your camera is you can come under the actual image plane, and you'll have this option. Where is it? Depth. So if I hold down, this will fall apart here. If this geometry starts going into the actual image plane, and that gets annoying, what you can do is you can do View Select Camera, go to Perspective. Hold on, grab this camera. I'm sorry. Go to Image Plane. Go to Depth, and then you can hold down Control and make it larger and get it farther away from your scene. You're actually increasing the size of the plane, but you're making it bigger. You're making it farther away. So that's one last option. So now I'll erase the cube, and let's go ahead and look through the camera real quick. See how that's nice and orientated the scene, so that if I were happen to create a polygon cube and scale it up and have it on the actual plane, I wouldn't have to reorientate it every time I bring an object in. Think about how hard that is to animate, okay? Something that's always has to be thrown off its axis or whatever. It's nice and easy to work within world space. So we're all set up here. We're all set up to put in the object. And one thing you might want to do is do a little play blast here just to see if it looks good. So I'm going to hit play blast, and I'll change my option down to say 75% on the scale and hit apply. And we're going to do a play blast here. And this is what we're going to be looking for. We're going to be looking for signs of drifting. Okay. It may look as if this object is drifting off the ground. Maybe a little bit drift. But if that's the case, if you find that you have any kind of type of drift, okay, what that usually means is you have to take that square, scale it up, and bring it back. Okay, if you get any drifting. Okay, and then we do that same fiasco again, where I go into my outliner. Okay, first I'm going to look through the camera itself. So I'm going to go camera, Buju camera, orientate it again, best I can. right? And really quickly check in object mode, make sure it looks like it's going down the street. It does. Possibly bring this in just a little bit of curve there. I'm going to bring it down the street, see? And now I'm going to do the same thing again. See how it's farther away? I'm going to take the cube, put it in the Buju data node, and with the Buju data node selection, the group node, I'm going to hit Insert, Snap to Vert, the bottom. Go back to my side view. Remember, this is the Buju data node, not the camera node, just the actual group node. I have to repeat that just because I know the students that I teach this, and they usually get a little confused on it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that here. Side view, bring that down like that. And it ain't rocket science, but now I can go ahead and hit this again, go to World View for translation, and bring it back here. And finally, scale it down. Now I go to side view just to see what I'm looking at here. Try to line it up with the ground plane and get it in the middle. So there you go. So let's go ahead and look at Buju camera. You can play through. It doesn't look like there's any drifting. So we're good to go. So this is just an introduction of how you move into tracking and so forth and get the camera lined up. And just to show you that the tail can wag the dog. You know what I mean? You have to adjust the camera to the scene instead of the scene to the camera. Okay, that's the best way to do it, especially if you're doing final gather and global illumination, which depends on scale as well as ambient occlusion. The next tutorial we're going to go over a few basics on some advanced mental ray nodes, specifically occlusion, before we jump right into Maya and get into render layers and so forth. So moving on to part 3, folks. Alright, in this tutorial we're going to go over ambient occlusion, just an intro of. Some people can go through entire college and not really know about ambient occlusion and its benefits. This is all through Mental Ray, so if we open up our render globals, we go down to Mental Ray. A lot of the stuff we'll be doing and rendering in will be Mental Ray, which is the rendering engine that comes with Maya. There's also RenderMan out there for a price. There's V-Ray, I think it's in beta form right now for Maya, soon to be out in regular form. Brazil, Final Render, that's another great one. Mental Ray will do just fine. We're going to be doing a lot of ray tracing, ray trace shadows and so forth. First example is just to get you guys a feel for ambient occlusion. Okay, so let's first show you render layers. So if you go under your channel box, you'll see display and render. We're going to say create empty layer, and what that does is it creates a master layer, which I like to use as a garbage bin for things. I usually never render the master layer. I usually just render the layers. And then layer 1. Layer 1 has nothing in it, so if I do layer again, I can create another layer and so forth. I can actually name these things. I can call them, say, occlusion. Voila. And I think I'll just delete this one. And what that means is when I render this scene out, when I do a batch render, okay, batch render, it'll render out a separate pass into a folder under your Maya images that will be occlusion. Now, if I want to render out master layer, I can hit R. Okay. Usually, I'll have beauty pass in here, which is what your regular pass is, and so forth. But for now, I'm just going to show you what these all mean. Like I said, master layer is usually your junk drawer. It's all these pieces you bring in, and then you assign them to different layers. So for occlusion, I'm going to right-click. I'm going to grab the pieces, go to occlusion, say Add Selected Object, just like you would do in display layers. So now we got master layer, occlusion layer, and now with the occlusion layer, I'm going to go ahead and create myself using my Snap to Points tool here. Create. Measuring tool, distance tool, and I'm going to go ahead and create distance tool here. That's two actual, what it does, if you look into your outliner, it creates two locators and a distance tool, measuring the distance between the two in whatever units you have set up, whether that be feet or centimeters. So I'm going to go ahead and bring these puppies down. So here we got here, if I move across, the distance. And where that's going to be handy when we do occlusion. So under occlusion layer, I'm going to right click I'm going to say presets, and there's many different ones here you can use. Occlusion. This is going to create and assign an occlusion shader. So I'm going to hit occlusion. And what that did was, if we go into our hypershade, it created a mental ray shader attached to a surface shader node. A surface shader node is a Maya node, which is what you see is what you get. So it's not affected by lighting, it's not affected by shading, it's just what you see is what you get. What you see in your viewfinder is usually what you get. There's no lighting affecting it or anything like that. So it's great for cards, it's great for buildings in the background or matte paintings and so forth. So if we look at the actual network, if I grab the surface shader and graph the input-output nodes, we have this MIB ambient occlusion node. And we're going to be dealing with the samples, spread, and the max distance. So just by default, let's see what happens. So I'm in the render layer, and I'm going to hit render, see what happens. We get this indirect lighting, which basically has nothing to do with where the lights are in the scene. It has to do with the hidden corners of your scene. The more hidden they are or occluded from light, the more darker they are. And then the max distance is the distance as far as how far you want it to go out. And then the spread is how much spread do you want. So as you can see right here, these are tight corners, so it's going to be a lot darker. It adds plenty of weight to your model. This eventually gets multiplied over your regular render, your beauty layer, which we'll go into later on, but I just want to introduce first off how to create this. So I'm going to save this. That's with the default. So we're going to take this number 4, I'm going to plug it in. So I'm going to take my ambient occlusion node, and I'm going to say roughly 4, max distance 4, according to my measuring tool. And let's go ahead and hit render. Oops. Nope, don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to play this back and forth. As you can see, the max distance now is set to 4 units, which is about this far out. There is a little noise here, but that's as far as it goes out. So big difference. If I want to increase that, I can go ahead and do so. Let's see, we'll double it. Come in here and say max distance 8. And we'll go ahead and save this image and render again. More diffuse, a lot lighter. These areas are pretty tight though, they're still black. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. As you can see, now that the distance has been added, it's a lot more spread out and so forth. And the last feature that we have here is the spread. So I'm going to go ahead and take that spread and bring it down to 0.2. I'm going to show you the difference. Our distance hasn't changed, but our spread has. And as we can see here, a lot darker, more concentrated, more contrast. And it's not recommended to do 0.2. Usually 0.8 is the best. So I'm going to do 0.8 again here. And I'll just remove this image as I can. And the last thing we're going to look at is the samples. So let's go ahead and increase this to 64. Okay. Let's go ahead and hit render. And what samples does, it increases the samples so there's not that much grain. There's less graininess. When you animate these things, when you get an image sequence rendered of them, you can get like a grainy animation going if you don't have your samples set up high enough. So here's this one. Let's remove that image and just cross-compare these two, and let's look at the grain. So as you can see, it's very grainy here. It's a lot cleaner there. See that? Clean, grainy, green. So that's when you want to bring your samples up. You don't want to go too high, your rendering time will increase. 64 is usually a good sweet spot. And that is occlusion pass. We're going to go over use background shaders and all types of other shaders as well. But just for this tutorial alone, this is occlusion shaders and how they work. Whatever that pass you see will be rendered in compositing programs, multiplied over your diffuse pass. And we'll get into that much later as well. Alright, in lesson 4 we're going to go over a quick intro to, again, some more render layers, use background shader, render overrides, and primary visibility, and how they are used in production. This is a simple model here with a ray trace light, ray trace shadows, cube, sphere, and plane. And I created some render layers which also have all this assigned to each layer: ground occlusion, shadow, diffuse. So I'm going to go ahead and hit work with the master layer here. This is my garbage bin area. I'm going to go to diffuse. And what's really cool about this is the first thing I'm going to do is give this material, let's make it a little specular, so we're going to make it a blend. So I'm going to put that in there. So we're going to add a blend to it. And if we look through all the different layers here, they're still all blends. So we're going to add one more layer here that I forgot about, and that's specular. So, put that right about there. So we got diffuse, shadow, specular, ground occlusion. And we've also got to assign this to our specular. Alright, so let's first do diffuse. This is a real easy one. Right click, preset, diffuse. Let's go ahead and render that. That's created its own render overrides. Ta-da! That's it. We got our diffuse. There's no shadows. It's just shading. There's no reflections. No nothing. No specularity or anything like that. Then we can go to specularity. Bring that one down. And real easy presets, specularity. That's going to record just your specularity of the object. So here we are. Here's our spec shots. There's a little bright spot here, depending on your blend settings, and on the plane as well. And this is usually added or screened over. And we'll go over compositing methods later. Shadows. This is where we're going to incorporate use background shader. So under shadows, we're going to go under render hypershade. And we're going to create a Maya node called the use background shader. So here it is. I'm going to double click that puppy. And these three top ones are for reflectivity, the bottom one's for shadows. So we don't want reflectivity, we just want shadows. And that's what the shadow mask is, and that should be set to 1. So we're going to take our materials, we're going to assign them this new material, and in doing so, it's a green material, you'll see how it's different than the other ones. It's assigned a new material because it was assigned that while under the render layer option. So let's go ahead and hit our rendering here. See what we get. It looks like we got nothing. But if we look in our alpha channel, it's pretty much black, but it's the shadows. So if we were bringing this in the compositing package, this would be like a black piece that we can multiply over in compositing. And color correct and blur, so we can just have that ultimate control over all of our elements. Okay, so there's shadow. Now ground occlusion. I want to get occlusion, but I don't want to say I don't want occlusion for these layers right here. Just this ground layer. So what I can do is I can go ahead and right-click the ground occlusion layer and say presets occlusion. And it's going to create me that occlusion like we showed in the last lesson. Here it is, ambient occlusion. And just for this example, I'm going to turn off the primary visibility of these two objects. Now there's a few ways I can do that. I can do that individually by coming under here and clicking each one of these off like that, and then I get my override. Or grab this one, say create override like that, or remove the layer over right here, and remove the layer over right here. I can do this in my attribute spreadsheet if I got a million objects. So it goes Windows, Generator, Attribute Spreadsheet. And if I go under Render, I can see primary visibility. There it is. And I'll just turn this off. And that creates a render override. Now what is primary visibility? Primary visibility means it's there, but it's not there. That means it's going to be seen in reflections, it's going to give shadows, it's going to give whatever, but it's not going to physically render. And the best example to show you that is the render which we'll do right now. So here we go. Here's our ground occlusion pass. Let's go ahead and do a render. understand what this means. So here we are seeing our alpha. Should have turned it back to color before we rendered it. Give that a few seconds. Okay. There you go. It's there, but it's not there. Okay, and this works as well as in reflections, as well as shadows. It's just laying out a shadow, but it's not actually there. So that's what a primary visibility is, and we'll get more into that and explain it on a deeper level in the future tutorials. But that's just a basic introduction of all the different types. You can also, if you want, under diffuse, which is an example here, I can do presets that are here. I can also do assign material override, and any material that's in my hypershade I can assign to, and everything will get assigned to it. If I say create new layer override, I can assign it a new, like I can say Fong, assign it to Fong. And that creates a new Fong that's assigned to everything in that layer. So that's just a basic introduction. We're going to go further in this, but I thought it'd be best to show it simply and then move into really hard stuff. Alright, in this tutorial we're going to go over HDRI imaging. So what is HDRI? Well, if you ever see in a movie making of, you always see that guy out there with that reflective ball right after they shoot any live action shot that requires CG. Well, you're going to do the same. After you shoot your plate shot with your HD or DV cam, you're going to get that camera out of the way, and you're going to place in its place, you're going to put a digital camera. And you're going to take 12 exposures of a reflective ball put where your subject was, probably just hoisted on a tripod or something. And you're going to take those and you're going to bring them into a program called HDR Shop, which is free at hdrshop.com. And you're going to compile all those into one image, which is a high dynamic range image, HDRI. And that is going to be used to light as well as add reflections to your scene, in our case, the mail truck. So if you go to hdrshop.com, it's free, download it here. There's tutorials on how to shoot it and how to create HDR images and so forth. Real simple stuff. If you go to links and you go to Light Probe Image Gallery, there's a few example ones already done for us here. I think the one we're going to be using is this one, Overcast Breezeway, Soda Hall, which is a little bit of a green and a big highlight on top. So let's go ahead and open up HDR Shop. Here it is. Here's the probe itself. The bigger your image, the bigger you make your images, the better. I mean, there are digital cameras out there right now that can go up to 10K, and I don't know how big it's getting now, but it's getting pretty insane. This is actually pretty small. I'm going to go ahead and do image panoramic transformation, and we're going to go from mirrored ball to latitude and longitude. I'm going to hit OK. And then we get this unwrapped world map, which we're going to save out. So I already saved it as flattened. So that's it. This is going to be rewrapped around a ball in Maya, and that's going to do two things. One, it's going to add lighting and shading to your object, and two, it's going to add reflections, either all together at once or two separate passes. So, with that said, we're into Maya right now. We got a simple scene with the mail truck. We did shoot it at this angle. I got a chrome ball here using a Fong. This is a blend material, uniform blend with a diffuse texture, or the texture on it. So what we're going to do is, we're rendering with Mental Ray. So I'm going to go into my render globals, and we're going to go to Mental Ray. And after a little bit of time here, we're going to choose production mode, and we're going to come down to environment, and we're going to choose image-based lighting, and I'm going to hit create. Alright, and what that does is in your outliner you're going to get this new little node called Mental Ray BL1. That's your image-based lighting. And if I can't see it here, but if I hit view select camera and I hit my far image plane up and bring the clipping plane up a little better, I can grab it. There it is. I can rotate it. I can scale it. I can translate it. Scale really doesn't matter. So if I take this and image name, I'll plug in my file, and I named it flatten. So flatten.hdr. There it is. I can't see it too well, so I'm going to do hardware alpha, and I'm going to increase that up so I can see it. So there it is. Whoop-de-doo. And we shot it from this direction. We only got 180 degrees of the actual 360 degree panorama of the room. And we'll know that pretty obvious because when we look around the room, we're going to find an area on the HDR image when it was wrapped around where we got this light speed futuristic Star Trek thing. And we see a line that is pretty much where the unwrapping ends. So I want to get to, in the shot, I'm going to want to get to where my shot was, and I'm going to rotate this around until the Star Trek look is kind of like in the opposite direction, because I want to collect all the reflections that I took from this camera here, all here onto this object here. And I don't, it doesn't matter what sort of reflections or lighting happened on this side because we're never going to see it. We're only lighting from this side, which is probably the Buju camera. So I'm going to rotate that so I know that all my good stuff that's wrapped out properly is going to come and reflect onto this actual truck. And here's my Fong chrome ball, basically. This material, we can take a look at it really quick. It consists of a Fong. The color is black. Its cosine power is 20. Specular color is way up. Reflectivity is way up. Reflective color is way up. Doesn't really matter anyway. So let's go ahead and hit a render and see what this looks like. So there you go. You can see where the reflections are turning off really nicely. It's always good to have a ball in your shot to see how the reflections are going. This material is not very reflective, so you're not going to see much, but you are picking up some reflections here and there. You really don't want your objects to be perfectly reflective like mirrors, so a good way around that is I'm going to go into the blend material of this truck, and I'm going to come down to Mental Ray tab, and you'll see this option for reflection blur and refraction blur. I'm going to bring that up to say 2 and set these up like 3.3. See how that looks. So I'm going to hit that, and then I'm going to go ahead and render it out again. And you'll find that the reflections, if we take a look right here, including the upping these two options right here will help you out. One of them, at least, will get the graininess away. But you see how we're going from really sharp reflections to really blurred reflections. And let's see if we can increase the blur limit to say 6. Yeah, let's go ahead and render that. And that's going to degrain this whole graininess as we go on here. See, it's I didn't save the image too much, but we increase this. Let's see if we increase this up. Let's leave it as. You get the point. So anyway, we're getting our reflections and so forth, but I want to have this all on separate layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go under Render Layers and say Create Empty Layer, and wait a few seconds because I'm updating here. Come on. We're going to set this up with a reflection, specular, and diffuse pass. Diffuse pass is going to have final gather. The reflection pass will be a separate material, and specularity will be, of course, the specularity preset. So let's go ahead. We got our garbage dump master layer here. And we're going to go to our layer 1. We're going to name that diffuse. And then we'll layer 2, specular. And layer 3, reflective. There we go. Alright, so let's go back to our master layer, and let's go ahead and take all this stuff we have in our scene and assign it to each one of these layers. There we go. And for reflective, it's real simple. I'm going to just assign the same material I gave this ball here, which is, like I showed before, is simply a color set to black, cosine power 20, specular color all the way up, reflectivity all the way up, reflective color all the way up, so you get that chrome ball. So I'm going to right click and say assign existing material, and it's obviously the only Fong in the entire group. So let's go ahead and hit render, and we can see what that render layer does. So now we have this pass that we can render, and then we can add. That will be the composite mode add when we get into After Effects and combustion. The problem is I'm seeing, if I look here, I'm seeing this HDRI ball in there, and I can't get, you know, it's not, I don't want it there. It's just personal reasons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, grab my HDR image, and I'm going to turn off, if I don't see it, go under render stats. I'm going to turn off primary visibility. That way, when I get to reflectivity and render it again, I don't have to see it. I'm just collecting the reflections on here, and that's it. So as you can see, nice clear alpha, we get our reflections, and then we'll be adding this later on. Now specularity, that's pretty easy. Right click, preset, specularity. That's it. So let's go ahead and render that out. There we go, we get our nice specular pass. Different areas, depending on the material specular settings, you're going to get a different type of specularity. So, last but not least, diffuse pass. Now, what is the diffuse pass going to be? Well, I'm going to assign this truck basically the same material. It's just a blend with a file on it, but I'm going to assign it a Lambert instead. The Lambert doesn't have any reflectivity or specularity. So I'm going to go in my outliner. Now, and because I have this selected, diffuse texture, I'm going to select the male truck, and then I'm going to assign it a Lambert. There we go. Now let's go ahead and at this point we can get rid of this ball, and let's go ahead and render that out. Not much going on here. It's really not doing anything. Let me just make sure I'm checking something here. I'm going to turn off enable default light, and I'm going to let's just see what happens here. Nothing. We're not seeing anything. There's obviously something there, but it's not being lit by anything because there's no lights. And because there's no specularity or reflection, there's nothing going on. There's nothing. So we're going to introduce I'm going to grab this puppy first and make sure it's in there. And we're going to introduce Final Gather. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my render globals, and I'm going to choose Final Gather right there. And that's going to enact the Final Gather, so I'm going to bring down that tab. I'm going to set my accuracy to 200, my point density to 10. Actually, let's make it 6. And my Final Gather options, I'm going to use radius quality control, set my max radius to 14, and 10% of that is my min radius, which would be 1.4. Okay. Now, how do I measure the max radius of these balls? Well, I can create a polygon sphere, and I can scale it up to say, whatever, 12 or something, and I'll know that there'll be a bunch of balls like that that'll kind of blend together like a metal ball. And yeah, it's really a guessing game. You just try to avoid the disco look until you bring the radius up until you don't have that disco look anymore, which is a bunch of little spheres showing up on your object. So with that all said and done, we're going to go ahead, like I said, we're going to take this image, and now that we have everything set up for the lighting, I'm going to go ahead and hit render, and this is going to have Final Gather in it. Now it's hard to tell, it still looks like we're just getting a white image here, but we really are getting lighting from the scene. We're also getting indirect shadows and so forth. And you can see the little circles here. And we really are getting the lighting from the scene. We're getting that green area here and a highlight up here. Now, I could increase this if I wanted to. The way you control the intensity and so forth is through the color gain. And that can be, the final gather can be controlled individually by adjusting final gather color effects, and then just changing this down. So if I bring this down halfway, okay, as you can see, we're getting a nice green image around and a white top. So there's actual lighting going on from the image itself. But as I decrease this, I'm actually decreasing the light to the point where if I brought the alpha gain all the way down, this would be a completely black image. Now, it's important when you light your scene with live action and CG that you do an equal amount, or just a balancing act between HDR or HDRI final gather and actual lights you create in Maya, which mimic the light setup that was on your live action set. So let's do a little 50-50 here. Let's go ahead and create a light, a directional light. I'll scale that puppy really high. And obviously, let's just go ahead and look where we're at. We got this big bright light coming down, sunlight. So I'm going to just kind of put it that way. And let's shoot it to, say, intensity 1.8. Let's see what happens now. So we're sort of having this complement the final gather rays. And it might be a little too much, but we'll see. Alright, so yeah, it's kind of blowing it out. We're not getting that nice green hue on there. So like I said, it's a balancing act between this light, which we can probably bring down to, say, 0.3, and the actual HDR image. And I always like this to be for the diffuse pass. Now, if you shot, what we're going to go over in the next tutorials is, in case you shot a scene and you didn't include HDRI image, or you were lost, you didn't have even an HDR image to be able to pull off this sort of indirect lighting here. And that goes into the main tutorial, which is setting up all the different render layers and so forth. So I'm liking what we got here. Okay, we got also occlusion passes and all types of reflective passes and stuff like that, where we can add on to this. But we're going to go over that later on. If we go back, if I can plug in another image, I can give you another example. So let's go ahead and open up HDR Shop, and let's open up one more file just to give you kind of an example of what I'm looking at. So here's this cathedral, and we're going to do it again. Image, panoramic transformation, mirrored ball to longitude, latitude, save as, and flatten to. There we go. Alright, so I'm going to grab my image-based lighting, and I'm going to go to my desktop and go to flatten to. And once again, I have to find out where that goofy point is, where it starts to get warped. And I think we're there. Let's go ahead and take a render of this and see how it looks. Now, of course, we're not going to be including this light. Let's go ahead and pull that out. And I'll take this image right here, and I'll bring back our final gather color gain back to where it was before. Let's take a look at what happens here. So what's really cool is a lot of your lighting is being done by this actual HDR image, which is really nice. So here we have the final gather rays being shot out first, and then the final render, of course. So this is just, once again, just an example of how you can light your scene with HDRI, and then with a little bit of help from regular Maya lights, you can get the really nice tweaked image that you're always looking for. So let's go ahead and render this out, take a look, and then we're going to move on to our final shot. Or, I'm sorry, our final tutorial, which is the big one. So as you can see here, I could probably increase my rays as well as my radius. So big difference there.
Okay, in this example, we're just going to go over some really basic compositing before we move into our final render layer scene. This was taken from the layers from the previous tutorial, and I sort of layered up them in Photoshop. I wanted to show you how to do them in Photoshop just in case you're looking to do still images and not moving images. So I've got them all layered here. I've got occlusion, reflection, specular, so we can go through all these. Here's diffuse, and here is occlusion, and here is reflection, and here is specular. So they're all set to normal, as you can see here. We're going to have to change that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take occlusion and turn that on, and then I'm going to do multiply. Okay. And as you can see, if I just turn it off and on, it multiplies the image and pretty much just darkens those nooks and crannies and really adds weight to the object itself. If you want, you can take this and double it up. So you got twice as much darkness if you want. I wouldn't recommend that. If you want to change the opacity, if you think it's too much, you can decrease that if we're more of a diffuse weather on the day. The next step is reflection, so we're going to turn that on. And this, of course, was just that chrome ball. And we're going to usually add this, but I'm just going to do screen. And as you can see, it's pretty bright, really brightens things up, but you are getting the reflections and so forth. And knowing that the mail truck is not a chrome ball, we're going to bring the opacity down to say about 36. 36 will do. So we get some reflections here and over here. And the tires themselves shouldn't even be reflective. So usually you omit those when you do your render layers, which you'll see in the examples to come. The next one, of course, is specular. And then we're going to just take that and we're going to screen that over. So let's take a look at the difference. And what's great about this is now that we have this in a comp, we can start color correcting. We can do image, adjust, color balance, and say if we want this to be more of a blue hue for the diffuse. And then if we want to adjust the color of the occlusion, we can also do that. Because remember, shadows are not always perfectly black. They can be blue, you know, and other types of shadows depending on what you're dealing with. Reflection, we can also adjust if we want to. Not too crazy about doing that, but specular, if we do image, adjust, see color balance, and we can make it a little bit more blues, so to speak. So it's kind of hard to see, but if you look in this little corner right here, we're starting to get more of a blue hue. And that's pretty much it. That's a simple example of compositing. And already you can see this is looking really nice, with the exception of these tires here that are a little too bright. But that's why we work on render layers and we work in independent pieces. But I'd say right now let's head into the next tutorial, and I'll see you there. All right, now I'm going to ask you to open up the Dark Alley Pan Part 2, my binary file. We're going to go over in this first part here an introduction of what all this crap is in this scene. There's a lot of stuff thrown into the garbage bin, the master layer. So I just want you guys to take a look at it and know what it is and just how it works. Like I said, anytime you create something, you want to start in your master layer. If you're working with layers and then you think, well, I need something, then go back to your master layer and create it, and then start adding it to your different layers. A few things we have here. We have this animated 3D texture node for the dirt. If we go ahead and play the animation. We also have multiple floor layers here, which I'll go over why that is. I have this little piece here, which is really more along the lines of a flag that kind of hides the light of this area light that comes down for the shadows. And right here I have an ambient light, and I have a point light, and over here I have a point light as well. So one thing you'll notice about a lot of these lights, and I recommend you guys definitely get into doing this, is using quadratic fall off. That's real world fall off of light. Light doesn't travel forever, it actually falls off as far as its intensity. And quadratic is the closest to real world as you possibly can get. So yeah, your intensities are really high, but
this light will fall off about right here. So just keep that in mind. I have certain areas, like certain pieces that are reflective. I have this right here. These are all pieces in my scene that would require reflection. There's a water puddle in the shot. There is a guardrail. And of course, just to make things a little bit more real, a nice subtlety is any water that's picked up by the actual tire treads will be animated here. So it just doesn't look like this thing went over a pile of water and didn't, pick up any water. So that's just these little tiny details that really make a huge difference. And just first off, before we go into the render layers, I'm going to go over to display layers and show you what these things are. As you can see, here's our Buju camera. I'm in perspective right now, but that's our Buju camera. And I'll just play it through to give you an idea of what's going on. I don't believe that we are seeing the image through here. We also have an HDRI image. Now, here's an example of when you go on the set and you don't have an HDRI image taken. Well, to cheat that, I've actually taken one of the images from the actual shot, which is in HD, which is 1020, 1280 by 720, and I've actually wrapped it around the HDRI input and used it for just reflections. So I've definitely got it. I've got something I can use. It's not the best, but it's a low dynamic range image and it works. Like I said, I recommend going over the HDR tutorials and go to hdrshop.com and learning how to basically go out and shoot these things on set. So, with that said, let's take a look at the different display layers. We got the light stick. This is always a great thing to have in your scene. The reason why I have a light stick in here is because I want to be able to judge the lighting in comparison to the actual plate shot. And I was looking for the fall off of the light as well as the shadows, intensities, and so forth that are basically coming from this area light. And I'll show you a little later how that comes in handy. We have the mail truck and occlusion geometry and reflective geometry. Might as well just show these individually here. Here's the occlusion geometry. Here's the reflective geometry. Obviously, that's just the puddle, little puddle spattles, and your actual guardrail. And then we got the shadowing geometry. And this is the geometry that's used to create the shadow because this mail truck actually kind of goes over an overpass. So we have to create some sort of shadow effect within the computer here. Now, just relying on the actual lights that or the actual HDRI that we got on set or so forth isn't going to cut it. We're going to have to recreate the scene a little bit and cheat it with actual mile lights. So with that all said, I'm going to go over to the render layers, and in the next tutorial we'll go over this first area here, which is the basics, and then for advanced stuff we'll be getting into these right here. So I've kind of sectioned them off to say that really you only need these amount of render layers, and then this stuff up here is for added bells and whistles and so forth. So let's get started. Alright, we're going to go over this first area here, and then if we have a little time we'll go over these other passes, but I want to get through the primary render layers, the ones that are necessary for your comp. Right now we're in the garbage layer, which is master layer, which is the one we never render. We're going to go ahead and go to occlusion ground, and it's good to have wireframe unshaded on because when you look at occlusion material it's usually black. And as we can see, these are the pieces that we have that are added to the occlusion ground. The only difference in this is these pieces have occlusion, these pieces have occlusion as well. But if we look under our general editor's attribute spreadsheet, you'll find under render that the primary visibility of the car itself is off, as you can see right here. And there's one on right here. I'm not sure why that is. Better turn that off. Okay. So as you can see, primary visibility is off all the way for this piece. So that when we render this, we're going to get just an occlusion of the ground. So let's go ahead and go to my Buju Cam, and I'll set up an animation right there, and I'll hit the render button. Now these are going to render pretty big, so I'm going to have to scale them down for this window. We're rendering at 1280 by 720, which is a pretty high resolution because we're matching the plate shot in HD. So it's going to take a few seconds more to render these shots as best as we can, but I might stop the render halfway just to let you know and give you an idea of what's going on. Why is it good to separate the occlusion of the vehicle and the occlusion of the ground? Well, the ground you might want to blur, and the occlusion of the car, the top piece, you might want to not blur. So the truck itself, occlusion usually doesn't get blurred, but the occlusion on the ground usually gets blurred, and as well as its opacity gets adjusted. So let me go ahead and shrink this down, give you an idea. There you go. As you can see, this is where the tires were. This is the fall off. It kind of looks like this smear. This will be multiplied over, and the opacity will be changed. And I like to keep it independent of the occlusion, like I said, of the actual truck, because this gets a certain color correction and blur, whereas the occlusion on the actual vehicle doesn't. So I'm going to save that. Now let's go ahead and switch over to occlusion truck. Now it looks like nothing really has changed, and in reality, really nothing has. The only difference is these two have switched places. This one is now set for primary visibility off, and this is set for primary visibility on. So what's the purpose of having an actual piece of geometry in there? Well, because the tire is actually going to be eating into the ground, and we want to make sure that we don't have this perfect tire, that's comped over our ground. We want to have it actually deflated from the actual ground. So the best way to do that is actually have a stand-in piece of geometry. So really, these two pieces have flipped primary visibility. And we can look at that if we go into Windows, General Editor, Attribute Spreadsheet. If we go into Render, we can see primary visibility is off. So with that shown, we can look at the pieces of this vehicle. Windows, General Editor, Attribute Spreadsheet, and go to my Render, go to Primary Visibility. There it is, and it's all set to on, as you can see here. And that's all for that specific layer alone. Any changes we make in these layers creates overrides, so that's important to know. So let's go ahead and go back to our Buju Cam, and let's go ahead and hit render. And once again, this is going to get huge, and then I'll have to shrink it down. But it's important to, once again, do your ground occlusion one pass and do your vehicle occlusion a second pass. That way you can have ultimate control of opacity, color correction on each piece individually. Because sometimes when you just throw an object down on the ground itself, you'll notice that the occlusion, is too dark or something, and you change the opacity, and then you end up changing the opacity of this piece had you have combined both occlusions. So you want to keep them separate. So I'm not going to let it render any farther than that. So there you go. So I'll just go ahead and squeeze this in here for you guys to see. And see the difference? So voila. And like I said, the whole point of that white piece is just to get a white background for a perfect multiplication. So what's left? Well, we got reflection ground, and that's where we've included all the pieces that could be reflective. We're going to go over how we create these pieces with the main mat, which I'll show you. If you notice, we're not seeing the original plate shot in here, and that's because these render layers have overrides for that. If I were to select the camera, go to image plane, see this display mode? It has an override on it, and that says none. Now if I want to see the original plate again, I can hit RGB. And then a little time, we should see the actual plate shot. Okay, guess not.
The camera itself might not be in this, but we'll go over that later. But as you can see, display mode was override to put none so that we don't actually render the background image. So what's going on in this scene? Well, these objects right here are, once again, primary visibility is off. It's going to put its reflections onto this water as well as this guardrail here. And the guardrail and the puddle itself is a use background reflective shader, which reflections are totally up. The shadow masks are turned down. That's a custom shader I created where I would collect reflectivity but not shadows. So if we actually do a render of this, there you go. And it's pretty rickety, the actual drawing out of the puddle that was actually on the set. But as you can see, we've captured just the reflections, and we could bring this over and add it onto the object. And we usually blur it a little bit just for blurry reflections and so forth, as well as get rid of this jaggediness that's around the edges, because we just did a really rough draw of the actual puddle that was on set. And I'll show you how to do that later. But there you go. Real simple, real easy. And last but not least is your beauty truck. That's what this primary visibility is on. If you notice in these other passes, there's no lights. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to perspective. No lights, no lights. Beauty truck has the lights. It has the area lights. It has the point lights. They're all in there. And then they have this piece, these shadow objects, so that this light creates the shadow. Now, this area light, if we look at it, has shadows set up. It's also got a linear decay, which is, if you feel it quadratic ain't doing it for you, linear is usually a good way for big lights that are like directional lights from the sun. If we come down to ray trace, we can see we got ray trace and shadows and so forth. So we're all set to go here. These objects, these right here, I don't think we have shadows on them. Pretty sure we don't. Oh, we do. There is some that are ray traced. But the main shadow here is this puppy right here. It's going to come down and it's going to project the shadow down onto the character when it's being occluded by the light as it goes under the overpass. So, and one thing I want to last note here is you can see we got this funhouse sort of perspective here of the street. It's a little bit of a cheat, and the reason why is because we didn't calibrate anything in Buju regarding the focal length of the lens. There's a whole bunch of calibration methods in Buju, but usually I just rough it and get a rough image here, and it's never really perfect because of just lens distortion and so forth, but it's a great start. So this is just a simple render. The lights are actually being used to light the actual car. The HDRI is actually going to put reflections in. So one thing I want you to also notice is these two pieces of geometry. If we go to Windows, General Editor, Attribute Spreadsheet, they have certain options on and off here. This right here, this piece right here, has excuse me, cast shadows are set to receive shadows are set to off. So if we look at this piece right here, okay, is set to cast shadows off. So it's not going to be cast shadows. So where is that in the actual render layer or into the render stats? Well, if we go to render stats for this object, we can see a whole bunch of craziness here. Primary visibility is off. Visible and reflections, visible and refractions. I don't want to have any of that. It casts shadows, but it doesn't receive shadows. That's the big one. Okay. So, and that's why this piece is important. We want it to cast shadows, but we don't want it to be in the reflection. We don't want it to be in the refraction. And we want its primary visibility off so that this HDRI image can bring the reflections through this material and onto the actual mailbox. It's a bit complicated, but after a while you kind of understand it. After you go through the understanding of primary visibility, receive shadows, cast shadows.
And we'll cover that as we build these piece for piece. So that's the first four. I'm going to go into the next one in these bells and whistles in our next tutorial. Alright, in this tutorial we're going to go over these remaining passes, which are more along the lines of bells and whistles. First one is Z-depth, depth of field. Real simple. I've taken the truck geometry and the wall geometry here and just simply right-clicked and said preset luminance depth. That's it. Let's go ahead and take a render of this. There you go. Farther away, the darker, the closer, the whiter. And this allows for a gradient for the computer to calculate and then allow for a compound blur in post to put certain areas out of focus and certain areas in focus. And we'll go over that a little bit later. Vector motion blur. This is where we're going to use that LM2D shader that we installed at the beginning of these tutorials. If I go to my Windows rendering hypershade, oops, not a good idea. And I come down, I find my LM2DMV. I've got it set to normalize 32. The more motion blur you have, the crazier your object moves around, the higher you might want to set this. You're basically trying to render your scene out and look to see that red is the most intense color. Yellow and green are usually lower levels of motion. And it's based on three things. It's based on the motion of the camera. It's based on the motion of the object in the shot, and it's based on the deformations of the object. So I can show you that in an example here. Let's look at the render layer of this, and let's go into its custom render globals. So here's Mental Ray. And the first thing you notice is we got, and these are actually in the instructions on the shader itself. You're going to turn motion blur to full. See how we have an override? And then we're going to go down to motion blur full, shutter open 0.5, shutter close 0.5. Basically it means the shutter is always open, so we're never really going to get a motion blur. And the last but not least override, the most important one, that if you don't have this, it doesn't work. And that is right here, custom entities. This past custom depth shader, that's not necessary. This is the big one that's important here. The pass custom alpha channel. Because otherwise, if you do this, you're not going to get an alpha channel. And an alpha channel is required for this to work. So make sure you have an override with pass custom alpha channel. So that's it. So let's go ahead and do a render and see what we get. And as you can see, the less motion, the more greenish, more bland yellowish. The more motion, the more reddish. And you can see the tires are spinning a lot faster. That's why they're getting this red here. And as we do a pan from the camera, this will actually get a lot brighter. So, you know, when it first passes the actual camera, it's going by pretty quick. So the color gradient's going to go more red. See how it's a lot brighter there? And then it kind of starts blanding out. So that's just something to understand, that we're going to use this pass later on to be used in After Effects as well as Combustion to get that motion blur done in post. So we don't have to do any motion blur in Maya, which is totally awesome. So anyway, the next one is the backlight glow option. That's pretty simple. I just took this object and assigned a surface shader with it. And if I take a look at the surface shader itself, if you ever want to do glows and so forth, usually you want to do glows in post. But if you want to do glows in Maya real quick, you can do surface shader, and then you can increase the outglow color to orange. It basically means what you see is what you get. So if I render this, it's exactly what I'm going to get. I'm going to get just this unshaded, perfectly orange color that I would bring into a compositing package and add glow to. So if I wanted the lights to glow, now this is like a daytime scene, so I don't think we're going to have any lights on it. Spec truck, as you can see, I took the tires out. It's just the object itself and these pieces right here. And really this spec truck is it's just for specularity, and all we did for that is do presets specular. So then if I render this out, we get a specular pass. Now it's important to still have our occluding geometry here to make sure that when this puppy goes under the actual overpass, we don't get that specular highlight because the sun ain't glaring down on it. So it's just something to keep in mind. Reflective truck. Once again, we just have a material on here that can be used like a chrome material. You can also use the fong we used earlier, and that'll render out a reflective pass that you can add or screen on. So as you can see here, same thing again, just reflections that are screened or added on. It's usually called a kick. It gives a little bit more reflection. The dirt pass. The dirt pass is a 3D texture node, and it's a little bit complicated. I actually parented these 3D nodes to the actual geometry because they were sliding around. So let's go ahead and find out where that's at. There we go. And not too complicated. It's a series of craters, mostly like brown, and it gives it that dirt effect. It's sort of like an occlusion pass. When we render it, it's actually assigned to a surface shader. What you see is what you get. There's no shading, and you get this dirt layer that can be just like an occlusion layer, be multiplied over, and you get a little bit of dirt onto the object. So make it less perfect. And finally, I animated a few edges on a piece of geometry for the masked water trail. This gets so the opacity is always down. It gets blurred a lot, but it's just basically like two planes that have been animated to animate where the tire treads are. And we're going to color correct this blue. We're going to opacity it down, and we're going to blur the heck out of it to mimic water trails left by the truck itself as it goes through the puddle. And that's it. It's not that difficult, and we're going to start out by going through all these different layers and setting up the overrides, and hopefully we'll get the image of our camera through Buju working again in the next tutorial. And you'll find that it's very, very easy. So let's jump right into that now. Alright, we're going to go over the first 4 primary render layers. In Maya. I don't think we're going to cover the rest because I pretty much explained those in the last tutorial. So let's take a look at our scene. This is, as we can see here, there is nothing in our render layers, nothing at all. I erased it all. I can play through the scene here. Here's our Maya camera, or Buju camera. And here's all these different pieces that I built over the time. You know, here's our lights. One thing I wanted you to notice is in my outliner, it's very clean. I got my stick, which is the light stick. I've got Buju Data, which is my camera node. Then I got my mail truck. I got my occlusion geometry, reflective geometry, shadow geometry, masking geometry, which is actually the tire tread water stuff. All my lights organized in one area, and just my 3D placement nodes here as well. Everything's nice and clean, real fresh. There's no disorganization. I'm not running around trying to find pieces. Everything's grouped and named properly. If I go into, like I said, my render layers or display layers, I got everything nice and organized here as well. Here's my light stick. So let's go ahead and start up our render layer here for the occlusion ground. I'm going to do a create empty layer, and that's going to create master layer. And this is where I just cherry pick what goes into that layer, which I'm going to call occlusion ground. Hit that now. I'm going to go back here. I know I'm going to have the mail truck, occlusion geometry, and I believe that's it. So let's go ahead and add it. Voila! Okay, now we haven't set this to occlusion yet, so I'm going to go ahead and right click, say presets, occlusion. And we have an occlusion pass. Now I have wireframe on shaded here just so I can see what the heck's going on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to occlusion, and you see this little ball, blue ball here? That means I have the overridden material. You can click on that, it goes directly to it, which is the surface shader, which is attached to a MIB ambient occlusion node. Now, you might want to get out your distance tool and measure the distance. I'm going to just put in a number like 14, and just for guesstimates right now. Later on, you could tweak that. So let's go ahead and look through the camera itself, and let's do a render. So I'll just come over here, pick a shot. This is going to render really big because it's 1280 by 720. We're rendering in HD resolution. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that your image plane for your live action plate is seen in the shot, and it's actually keeping you from getting a decent alpha. So I'm just going to stop it right here and kind of scale it down. I'm not going to render it all the way through. We're going to have to override to turn that off, and then we're going to have to turn off the primary visibility of the actual truck, because we want to separate the occlusion of the ground and the occlusion of the truck in two different passes, because the ground we might want to color correct, we might want to blur, and then the top one, this area, we might want to just leave alone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the camera, and now that I know that I'm under an actual render layer, I can make changes. And I'm going to go to my image plane, there it is, and I'm going to hit display mode, right click, and say create layer override. And I'm going to turn it to none. So let's go ahead and hit render again, see what we get, and we're going to get a really giant screen again. Now we solved that problem, but we still haven't isolated, turn off the primary visibility of this car here, as you can see. So the next step for that is to just select the car. So I'm just going to move up, basically grabbing a piece and move up to the group node. And like I said, while I'm in this render layer, anything I change will be a render layer override. So I'm going to go General Editor, Attribute Spreadsheet, and I'm going to move over to Primary Visibility, click the first button, scroll down, Shift Select second one, brings me all the way to the top. 0 is off, 1 is on, so I'm going to hit 0. That's going to turn off the primary visibility of every single little piece. I can just verify by taking a piece and looking, yep, there it is. It's turned off. So let's go ahead and do one final render, and we should be done with this layer. And as we can see right here, we got the occlusion. We got a little like donut hole there. That's no big deal because we'll eventually be layering on top of this the beauty pass. But we've isolated it, and that's it. So now that we have that, we're going to move on to the next layer. So let's go ahead and create another layer. And this is the occlusion for the truck itself. Occlusion truck. All right. So once again, I just got to go in my outliner and cherry pick what I want. So I'm going to go occlusion geometry, mail truck, bring that puppy up here, add selection, and then once again I got to do real quickly view select camera, image plane, and I'm going to say create layer override again. I got to turn it off each time. Sometimes you can turn it off and then have it on for the layers you want on, I guess. This might be a little redundant, but hey, it's up to you. So after we do that, we're going to once again create an occlusion pass for this, separate occlusion. Click on the occlusion option, go to color, and once again we'll spread max distance to 14. There we go. And let's go ahead and hit a render of this. Now, why bring in the ground plane? Well, you know, when a tire hits the ground, it kind of deflates a little at the bottom. So it wouldn't be smart not to have something to kind of eat up the tire so it looks like it's actually being pressed into the ground. So with that in mind, this is a real simple step. All we have to do now is grab the ground plane this time instead of this geometry, but the ground plane, and just turn off primary visibility. And that should do the trick. So let's go ahead and hit a render. So now we have the ground plane eating into the tire at the bottom a little bit, and we have the occlusion pass done on the car. Now I probably would have added the max distance, you know, up to maybe 20 or something. It's always good to have a very large scaled scene. You want to get it a little big, especially when you're doing global illumination and final gather. You want to really scale up your image to the point where your grid is very, very small. Okay. So that's it. The next layer, of course, is reflective. So we're going to go for that. Let's see, reflection ground, I'll call it. And go back to our junk drawer and go into our outliner. Let's go ahead and choose the mail truck. And let's choose the reflective geometry. And we'll add that. There we go. Now, the reflective geometry has, like I showed before, no, it doesn't look like it here. So we're probably going to have to create a use background shader for this. So I'm going to go into my hypershade. And because we're creating a new shader and assigning it onto that layer, it'll only be on that layer. So we're going to go ahead and look at the new background shader. And we'll change its reflectivity up, its mask down. We don't want shadows, we just want reflectivity. So let's go ahead and grab all these little pieces here. Let's see, yeah, there we go. Just move up because we got them grouped. And since we're in that actual render layer, we're going to assign it. It's going to assign specifically only on this layer, that material, to the selection. So let's go ahead and do a render pass of this and see what we have. Actually, first we got to turn the primary visibility off of this object. So we're going to go Windows, General Editor, Attribute Spreadsheet. And we're going to come to Render, and then Primary Visibility again. Click the first one, come down, click the second one, off. All right, so let's go ahead and do a render. Once again, we're getting that same issue again, where we got to, you know, it's a bit of a pain, but you'll get used to it after a while. Go to my image plane, create layer override, and turn off that image plane from our plate shot. And there you go. Real simple, check your alpha. And you would probably add this, blur it a little to avoid the super sharp edges. And there we go. We got a reflection over here from the guardrail, and we got a reflection on the ground from the water. All right, and last but not least, the beauty pass. So let's go ahead and hit beauty pass. Beauty pass usually means like your reflections, your diffuse and shadows all together at one. So let's go ahead and hit outliner. I'm going to probably want my light stick in there, Buju data node, and shadowing geometry, mail truck, and that should be it. So let's go to beauty pass and add those options. And don't forget our lights. We're going to add those as well. Ready? And once again, I'm going to have to do view select camera, go in here, display mode, create layer override, and turn this off. Okay. So what is the purpose of the light stick? Well, let's go ahead and stick that puppy in, shall we? Let's layer, get that light stick in there. So I'm going to get to the point where it's like, okay, I can kind of see the light stick. It's basically just a Lambert material that I can judge, you know, from grayscale, how the light is affecting certain zones, because I can't really tell what's going on the mailbox too much, or mail truck, because it's very bright, it's very white, and I can't really judge the fall off of the light and where the light is going, and depending on the quadratic fall off settings of these point lights as well as the intensity of the shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and use this as an example. So let's go ahead and render this out, and we'll see what we get. And as you can see here, we've got these pieces, we got our light stick, and see the purpose of the light stick is to see the fall off. We really can't judge it by the mailbox itself. Just look at the shadows, look at the fall off of the shadows and so forth. The biggest problem we have is this geometry. We don't want it to be visible. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these two pieces and we're going to turn off their primary visibility. So we're going to go to Windows, General Editor, Tribute Spreadsheet, and go to Primary Visibility and turn those all off for this render layer. And then we got to go a little farther here. We want this to cast shadows, but not receive shadows. And the same thing here. We want this, well, it's not really going to matter because the primary visibility is off, but it's this area right here we don't want receive shadows, we don't want it to cast shadows. We don't want them to cast any shadows onto this actual character here, just this piece right here. So let's go ahead and render that again. And as you can see, we've got the pieces out. Of course, we're going to eventually get rid of this light stick, but like I said, the purpose of the light stick is just to see where the fall off of the light is and so forth. You see we're pretty blooming right here, which is important because in broad daylight, this car itself should actually get hit pretty hard with some harsh lighting. So if I actually pull back, what I like to do is I like to save the image by clicking right here, and moving it, 4 or 5 different frames in the shot. So I'll choose this one right here. I think at this point we could probably get rid of this light stick, so I'll get rid of that for now. And let's go ahead and render this out again. As you can see here, we got a real bright spot here, which might be a little too much. And this is where you're tweaking the lighting. You're kind of looking at, okay, it goes into the shadow there. Maybe I got to take the intensity of these lights down. Who knows? There's also a process in post where you can fix these little problems, as well as the color correction, because we're not using Final Gather here like we did in the previous examples. We're not getting the actual environment lighting in the scene. So one thing I could do is come into my scene and pop out of perspective and look at the intensity of my lights and just try to balance them to this scene. So I can look in my scene and it was relatively greenish. So maybe with this light here, I can add a little green tint, or I can color correct in post. But if I want to get it as exact as I possibly can, maybe I'll just add a little bit more green. And maybe the intensity is a little too high. So let's go ahead and hit the intensity down to say 3. And we can usually use all lights to see what's going on here. And I'll bring that down just a touch. And this, let's see how this light's going on here. Might be a little too intense, so I'll bring that down. So let's go ahead and try that now. See if that helps. Like I said, you're going to do a lot of fixing in post, a lot of stuff in post in your compositing package. But don't get freaked out. If what you see is not what you want, you can always fix it in post. Besides the fact we have no motion blur on this, we don't have any color correction or anything like that. So let's go ahead and render this. Alright, as you can see, a little bit difference here. It's still pretty blown out, so we might have to bring those intensities down a little bit more. But don't forget, we are in an environment where the lighting that we shot it at, there should be some blown out spots. But all this we're gonna fix in post. So that's it for this tutorial. All those other layers I kind of went over before, the top layers. I think you could probably figure them out by yourself. So we're going to move on to compositing these layers. And if you noticed in your track folder, there is a folder called passes, which has all of these passes rendered out already. So we can jump right into compositing, and you can just follow along. Okay, before we go into compositing, I wanted to show you real quickly how to draw those puddles in the water. And it's real easy. It's not hard at all. What you can do is you can grab a piece of geometry that's parallel to the plane of the ground, and then you could say modify, modify, make live. And that means you can draw on this material. So then you just go to Polygon, Mesh, Create Polygon Tool. And you probably want to get your screen as big as you can here. And we're just going to pick a point, and we're going to move. I'm going to hold down my left mouse button as I draw here, so I can move out of the way, see okay, a little there, a little here, here. I'm actually drawing on that plane itself. So you can get as detailed as you want. You don't have to get too crazy with this because you're going to blur it anyway. So I can move the camera a little bit here so I can get into more detail and see like, oh, maybe I got to go back a little, come around here, and I'm just going to, for the sake of time, hurry this up. And just bring that across. Now that I come about here, 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 here. And I might get these little spattles here and also. So I'm kind of like drawing back just to see where everything is. Real easy. Nothing. This is not complicated stuff. And then I just, for the guardrail, I just used a NURB surface that I created and just kind of warped it to fit the guardrail. There's not, you don't see too much reflection in the guardrail, but you'd be amazed how some things in your scenes that hardly ever there your audience will pick up on subconsciously. So you just got to be careful. So after that, I just hit enter, and I'm pretty much done. So if I go to perspective, and I'm probably going to assign a use background shader on this with reflection only. Same thing with my guardrail, and that's that. Alright, now with the renders already finished, we're going to get into compositing here. First we're going to go over the breakdown MOV file included with your DVD. If we look at the original plate shot, here it is, HVX, and we're going to play it through. Pretty simple. And then we see ground reflection pass that we rendered. Here's the guardrail right here. There's multiply, ground occlusion pass. This is, of course, alpha'd, so we're just going to go straight through. Then we got water tread marks with alpha channels. This is, that's all it is. We're going to bluify this and blurify it, no opacity it down. Beauty pass, as we can see right here. Nice shadow from that occluding piece of geometry we added. And we haven't really color corrected it yet, but you know, it's good for now. Not bad for just one simple blend material. As you can see here, a truck occlusion pass, and the tires are getting eaten in there, which is really awesome. And then we got our spec kick, which I showed you guys how to do earlier, and a reflective kick, and our truck dirt pass. Here's our velocity render. As you can see, as we start to not really constant, there's not too motion going on because of the camera following the object. We're coming into this kind of pale, crappy, pukish yellow. And as we pass, we got a nice bright orange, meaning a lot of motion blur. And there is an alpha in that. Here's our Luma Z-Dep pass, which will be used with a compound blur. We usually invert this image. So here we comping everything together. As you can see, I kind of added two occlusion passes there. And one is the blurred ground occlusion, just a little bit more, so I got a little bit more darkness added to, and just add that on. Sometimes you want to double up your occlusion passes, especially your ground, depending on your scene. So there's the motion blur added. Motion blur really makes things come to life. I can't really push that anymore. Now, you'll notice in the final comp, it's looking pretty good, except it looks like somebody got shot up against this thing. Probably a little overkill on the dirt. But as you can see, it really looks awesome, but it starts to give itself away a little bit at the end here. And that's because the lighting doesn't make sense for this side of the vehicle. You see right here, this, the lighting should be the same here as it is here, and it's dark. And that's something you can tweak out, but I left that discrepancy in there just so you can get an idea of how easily people can pick up on your mistakes of lighting. So a good remedy for this is to add maybe another point light here with a quadratic fall off and fill in that light and just get this whole area more less sharp and more diffuse. And a lot of what you don't see here is some of the color correction we did in post. So we're going to go over that right now. Alright, before we go into compositing, I wanted to bring up a very important point that will save you some headaches along the way. Whenever you're prompted to save out an image sequence from After Effects or Final Cut or Premiere, you're going to have to make sure that you have a point, the number, and then a point. In other words, the number itself is isolated in your sequence. If you don't have this, say if your file looks like this, it's not going to work in Maya. It'll only play the first frame. So it's important to have these numbers isolated. So how do you do that? Well, when it says save out the file, whatever format you're using, you usually will write file, period, period, IFF, or period, period, Targa, or whatever. And this is what's going to give you, in the end, this result for all your files. Exactly how they have to be set up to be read in many different packages, especially Maya. So it's just a word to the wise here. I'm telling you, it'll save you much headache when you're trying to bring this stuff back and forth in between editing programs and Maya. Alright, we're going to get into compositing here. The first package we're going to be doing this is with Combustion, which is my personal favorite. I know there are a lot of Shake fans out there that might squirm when I tell them that, as well as After Effects people, but I find Combustion to be one of the easiest. It's great for matte tools and so forth, and I'm not too impressed with After Effects' default matte chokers and so forth. They don't really blend the image into the background too well. But we'll cover After Effects as much as we can. The first thing I'm going to do under my options here is to go into File, Preferences, and I'm going to go into Monitor and make sure, or I'm sorry, General, and make sure that I have frames and not time code. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit New, and I got 1280 by 720, square ratio, 24 frames per second, no fields, 80 frames, 2D 8-bit. And that should do. So I'm going to hit import. Now, if I hit home, that's the actual resolution of the file itself. Since I'm dealing with a lower resolution for lecture purposes, I could just hit home, and then it'll frame it the best it can into this shot. So it's actually a little lower. I can hold down pan and move around. I can zoom up if I want to get really close to details while it's playing, and that's the coolest part about Combustion, I think. So let's go ahead and start importing. So I'm going to make sure my little cursor here is at the beginning. I'm going to hit Composite and do File, Import Footage. And we're going to start with our plate shot. So I'm going to click on that. There it is. And then after that, we can layer on in order if we like ground occlusion. So we'll throw that puppy on there. So here's ground occlusion. And let's take a look at that. Now something happened, this happens once in a while with your alpha channel. So if it does happen, you can go to Composite Control and then come to Settings, let's see, Output. And it usually has to do with your alpha. Your alpha is inverted, so you got to be very, very careful of that. So I'm just going to go ahead and invert the alpha. So I'm going to have to take this ground plane and do Operation, and then I'll do Channels, Invert. And if I go to the Invert option, I'm going to change this to Alpha. That's just, sometimes it happens like that. It's goofy, so you got to bring in alpha, invert, and change the channel to alpha. So there's our layered on top occlusion pass. So I'm just going to take that, as we're working in layers here. And if you look under Composite Controls, we have Normal. And this is where the add shows up that's different from the screen. And we're going to use Multiply for this. So there you go, where you already got, if you can take a look, you can see it in there. It's there's a little bit of a ground plane going on. Moving on, we're going to do File, Import, and let's go with the actual truck itself, Truck Beauty Pass. And we can play it through, and there's our truck. everything's looking really good. Now let's go ahead and keep going here. Let's add the occlusion to the truck. So let's go truck occlusion. And because I move my cursor here, if I go to my timeline, it's out of sync. So if I left mouse drag and put this in, just like these other pieces, I should be good to go. And of course, for this layer, I got to go into my composite mode and say multiply. So there you go. Already it's looking pretty good, looking really nice. Maybe a little color correction could be needed, but you know, because we got more green here and more white here. But already we're getting a good feel on this. Alright, so I'm going to bring my cursor, my timeline all the way back to 0 when I import again, import footage. I'm going to try truck reflection kick, and let's see what else we can add here. Okay, let's go ahead and add the truck dirt, and let's take a look at that. And I don't know if it worked or not. Let's take a look. I think this is the same issue again where we have to flip the, invert the alpha. So I'm going to do that, and sure enough, I just control C and control V over here, and I flip the alpha on here. Once again, sometimes this happens. And then we can take that, and then we could multiply that over. Now we have our dirt. Now how about reflection and specularity? Well, that's next. So let's go ahead and hit File, Import Footage, and let's go to Reflection Kick. Put that puppy on. And, oh, I'm sorry, this is the ground reflection. We forgot about the ground reflection. So here's the ground reflection. Let's layer that in under the actual truck. There we go. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to blur it. So I'm going to do Operation Blur. We'll do a Gaussian blur, and we'll blur it a little. And then we'll take it and we'll bring its opacity down. So now it's a nice subtle effect as we scroll across here. Let's see. And it's hard to see. Maybe we should bring up the opacity a little bit more. You see how cool these pan and home tools are in Combustion? It allows me to really, and I can actually cache this footage and actually look at it as it goes by. So just to see the difference, you can kind of see it in there. I think our Gaussian blur is like a little too high. Just 3, and then I'm going to come back and bring the opacity up. There, that looks good. So I'm going to hit home, or I'm sorry, home again. That'll get it in the shot. Now let's go for that real kick. So let's go here to reflection kick. And once again, I accidentally imported it in the middle of the timeline. All I got to do is go to timeline and drag that back. All right. And this I can either add or I can screen. Usually add is good enough. So I'm going to go with composite controls and say add. All right. And right now it looks like a chrome ball. So what we got to do is we got to change the we can blur it as well as change the opacity down. So I'm just going to bring the opacity down to say 25 so we can get just a little bit of reflection in there. And last but not least, I'm going to go back to the beginning here, File, Import, Truck Spec Kick, bring that puppy in. And there it is. And once again, I'll probably screen this puppy over. And I can probably bring that down. So, you know, give it a shot, see if screen works and any difference in add. Add is alright. See how that looks. See, as we get in the shadows, it starts looking kind of funky. So it's up to you. I think for this render, I'm going to take out the spec kick just for the heck of it. And if you really want to adjust these things, you can actually work on the brightness and contrast, the levels as well, and just try to adjust those. There's a whole bunch of things you can do in compositing. In fact, I always say that, you know, any good CG school will teach compositing because that's actually half the battle. That's the amazing thing, is they usually don't teach you that. So here we are. It's about time we needed our motion blur. So I'm going to do File, Import, and bring in my truck velocity render. let's go ahead and take a look at that. And once again, we're probably going to have to invert this. Let's see, copy and invert. There we go. And I had to invert the actual alpha. Once in a while, and specifically in the renders that I did here, you have to invert the alpha. So just a word to the wise. So we have an alpha channel, we have our color, and this layer we're actually going to hide. So I'm going to drop this puppy way underneath our plate shot. So it's not there, and it's no reason to see it. But it has to be lined up in the timeline with everything else. So if we look right here, we can see that it's lined up completely with everything else to match up with the motion blur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all of these layers here, bring them all the way down until we get to the beauty pass, and I'm just going to put the motion blur on this pass just for render's sake. So I'm going to do operation blur, and if you installed your plugin correctly, it should be under revision plugins, and it's this puppy way at the bottom here, RSMB vector 3.x. It's the vectors, and you're going to get this red image on your screen. So just go into your vectors and go into your options for it, and it says motion vectors, and that's where you're going to choose which one of these is the vector render or the footage itself. So I'm going to choose truck velocity invert and hit OK. That's the one way at the bottom. And voila, we already can see some motion blur coming in here. I could probably increase this to say 1. Probably a little too much. Not too bad. And remember we set our normalization to 32? Well, we can set our max displace to 32. So now we are all set. We got ourselves some motion blur. The only problem is we need to get motion blur onto every one of these layers. So a quick way of doing that is Control-C for this layer, and then we have to add motion blur for all these layers. So I'm going to select all these layers and Control-V, and it's going to take a few seconds here. But as you can see, I'll grab this one as well, and then this one right here. So every one of them has the exact one with that motion vector on it. Every layer is motion blurred now. And it's going to take a little longer to calculate, but as you can see, we have a nice motion blurred shot. It's not the best to have these on when you're working in color correcting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn all those off for now, just so that they're out of the way. Okay, so here we are. We're back here, and right now we could probably do a few things like color correction. One way of doing that is to come to the actual file here and come to the beauty pass and go for color correction and go to balance, and I might add a little green in there, just a little green hint, not much. And then I could also go in and adjust brightness contrast. So I've got the color correction, brightness contrast, and I'll bring that down because the scene is a little bit more contrasty. And then go back and turn all these layers on, and we're all set. So regarding the depth of field pass, we'll get into that in the After Effects file, but it works in the same way. It's all done through a compound blur in the same way that we did our velocity pass. So we're going to cover that in After Effects, but this is a great introduction of just basic color correction and compositing in combustion. Alright, in this tutorial we're going to go over the After Effects version of compositing. We're also going to go over compound blurs with the Z-depth, as well as that whole water tread. So I basically imported all these files into a composition. If I go to my composition settings, it's custom 1280 by 720. Turned off locked aspect, square pixels, 24 frames per second. And I got a duration about 6 seconds here. And I can start pulling my files. As you can see, they're all named. Work is my original plate shot, so I'll just drag that puppy in. And if I hold down Shift and let it snap to the end, to the beginning, I can just snap it to the beginning there. Just like we did before in wrong program. In Combustion, we're going to go for the truck ground occlusion. So I'll throw that on. And hold down Shift and snap that. Once again, we're having the same issue with the channel. So we're going to have to channel, invert. And let's go to the effects, invert, and we're going to choose the alpha channel. So there we go. I don't think you'll have this problem when you render your own stuff. It was just what happened to me when I rendered this stuff out. So ground occlusion, I'm going to do operation. I'm going to right click on ground occlusion, and I'm going to choose under blending mode. I'm going to go all the way up just like we did before, multiply. So there you go. Multiply it over. We're going to add, let's go back to our project. And the next one up would probably be the ground reflection. So I'll bring that in. Same thing again, we want to blur this. So we're going to do operation, effects, blur, Gaussian blur. Blur that up, say to 0.2. And then we can bring down the opacity. So we'll go under transform opacity and bring that down, say 50%, somewhere around there. Next layer up, we're going to pull in the truck itself, truck beauty, bring that puppy on. There we go. Next one after that is the occlusion, truck occlusion. Drop that puppy on. And we're just going to right click and say blending mode, multiply. There we go. And then we can go to the next one up, which should be reflection. So we're going to do reflect kick that puppy on, and then we're going to have to add that inversion again because of the alpha channel. My mistake. Control C for the invert on this one, and I'll hit Control V. There we go. So now that I have that inverted, I can right click and say blending mode and say add, and then go ahead and bring my opacity down to whatever I think is the right level of reflection. All right, and now our spec pass, spec kick, put that in, and I'll just really quickly right click on that and say blending mode screen, and then we can come in here and set the opacity down to something. Now this, we can change this if we want to. Like for instance, I can take this and go back to blending mode normal, and we can do a little color correction before we blend it in. So I can do color correction. Let's see, I can go to levels, and I can just mess with the levels here and try to isolate. I don't want to have all this gray area here because that leaves a diffuse specularity. I want to have a nice sharp specularity there. So I'm going to mess with the levels a little bit. And now I'm going to take the object and do blending mode and go into screen. So as you can see, the big difference is this area doesn't get affected as much. And again, I'm going to come in here and change my opacity down to something that seems halfway decent. Maybe that. We could also do an add on this. Let's see how that works. Yeah, it brightens it up just a little bit. And then, of course, if you don't want it at all, you can just take it out. So once again, I'm just going to take it out for this circumstance. Let's go ahead and see what else we got left. We skipped over one thing, the mud pass. And the mud pass, I usually like to mud pass, depending on how you prefer layering. I'm going to put that one on last. So I'm going to choose blending mode, multiply. There we go. So now we have pretty much the entire truck itself starting to blend in, but we still have these sharp edges around the edge here, and we're going to go into how to fix that. So I'm just going to move along here and see, like, okay, looks good, looks good. In combustion, in order to fix these sharp edges, you have a thing called matte control, which does a combination of blurring, eroding, and kind of pulling in. And the matte controls in combustion are really what you want to do for all of these layers, just to blend it into the actual image. And we're going to go into that in a few minutes. But let's go ahead and just, for the heck of it, bring in our velocity pass. There it is. And what I'm going to do with the velocity pass, again, it seems like it's working. So I'm going to grab that and I'm going to hide it in the back, just like we did before. And I'm going to hide all of these layers until I get to the beauty pass again, and use this as my test subject. I'm going to go Effects, and again I'm going to be looking for a blur setting. And if you guys excuse me, I got to plug in the After Effects plugin. Alright, we're back. I just had to install the plugin for this. So for After Effects, as you can see, I'm going to grab that one layer that I do have seen, all the ones I kind of hid, Truck Beauty, go to Effect, and then I'm going to go Vision Plugins, the Vector 3.1, put that puppy in. Again, it's going to give me a red screen, and I'm just going to plug in that vector information, which is the truck velocity, and max displace 32, just like we had in Maya, set for the normalization. And blur, I'm going to set to 1. So there you go. Now, if we want this image to, see how it's really sharp here? It should be a little bit out of focus because it's getting farther and farther away out of the focus area. Well, that's where the extra layer of our depth of field pass. Remember our Z depth? Let's bring that in. And as you call it, like here's the Z depth. First thing we're going to do is we're going to invert this. So we're going to do Effect, Channel, Invert, and we got the darker areas out here and lighter areas, and we're all good to go. And then we're just going to hide that under the truck, like somewhere in the area of the truck velocity. And I'm going to take the Truck Beauty and I'm going to do Effect, Blur, Compound Blur. And with the Compound Blur, I'm going to choose the blur layer as the Z depth. And already we can see the blur amount is like way over, so we're going to take the maximum blur and bring that down to, say, 3. That's probably too much, probably like 2. And what is happening is the farther it gets away, the more it gets blurry. So it's sort of like a fake depth of field kind of spiel. And as we get closer to the object, the more it's going to be in focus. Now, of course, we got the motion blur added to this. But it's a great tool just to get that nice blurry effect as it gets farther and farther away. Once again, we can just use some, we can do some color correction here. As we can see, the scene is very blue. A good tool for that is Tint. So if I go to Truck Beauty, I can do Effect, Color Correction, Tint, and then I can take the blacks, map them to this kind of area, and make the whites this area, and then I take my tint amount and I just put just a little in there, say like 3 or 4. And see, it's a world of difference. So let's take, turn it off, turn it back on. This is probably too intense for the whites. Probably can get a white value, like white over here. And then the blacks, we want to get blacks like that. So as you can see, as I add a little bit of tint, it gets color corrected in pretty well. I'll just turn that effect off and on. You can see what it looks like. So we're getting a little bit of effect. We probably could just add a little bit more blue into the object itself through some color correction. Now, the main issue I want to go over here is, I'm going to turn off a few of these layers, and you can turn them off by using this little effects tab. So I'm going to turn off the motion blur, I'm going to turn off the compound blur, turn off the tint, and we're going to get a little closer here to the object. Take a look at the edges here. You can see right here we got some pretty sharp edges and they don't blend in too well. So the way that you actually handle that is through matte controls. Now, the matte controls in After Effects, I'm sure there's other plugins that can do the job, but they're not the greatest. So the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of eat into this. So I'm going to do Effect, Matte. Let's go with Simple Choker. Now let's go ahead and see what that does. So Simple Choker. And I'm going to choke the matte. See how that kind of eats into the matte? It's eating into it. So we want to eat in a little bit. And then we're going to take this and do Effects, Blur. And we're going to blur a channel. So we're going to do Channel Blur. And with Channel Blur, we're going to not blur anything except the alpha. Let's go ahead and blur that alpha just a little bit. So we ate into the image a little bit, now we're blurring the alpha. So it's blended in just a little bit more, and it's a lot better. So here, let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like without the effect. So it's pretty sharp, but then it's nicely blended in. Now, like I said, Combustion has a great tool called Matte Controls, and I think I'm going to show that in my last tutorial because I didn't cover it in the video before, but I think it's really important that you understand the matte controls in Combustion because those are quite possibly the best in the business. So once again, it's just copy-paste time for everything else. So I'm going to come back into my truck beauty shot here and turn on all my files, and of course I'm going to probably take these two and hit Control-C and come back up and select all of these layers and Control-V for copy. And every one of these should have the same exact motion blur as well as the depth of field blur. Now let's turn all those layers on. By the way, if you ever want to just look at one layer on here alone, you can hit this little circle button and that'll isolate it. So if you want to see just these three layers together, if you have none of them selected, it goes back to the full gamut. So there you go, a nice composite where you can continue to do keyframe color correction if you like. But that's pretty much it. So I think we're going to end this with one more video on Combustion, and we'll call it a day. Alright, in our last tutorial here, I'm going to go over a few things that were loose ends, one of which was in Combustion, the matte tools. I'm going to take up the Truck Beauty layer, and I'm going to do Operation. It's been a while, folks. Keying Matte Controls. Okay, and this, to me, is one of the most, this is the greatest tool that this program has to offer. I'm going to go ahead and hit Shrink, Erode, and Blur Matte Filter. And if you can see the difference, it's night and day. Okay, now we can come in a little close here and kind of get an idea as far as how far we should push this. So let's go ahead and see that we're starting to eat away at the reflector here. So what we're going to do is shrink maybe too much, so we're going to do 0.5. And I think that's just about right. But you can see the difference here. It's huge. I mean, it really blends this image into the background. So it's all a matter of taste, erode and filter. It's all up to you. So once again, I'm just going to take these two, hit copy, and add that to my occlusion pass. Add that in. And there you go. Now, the last thing that I want to mess with, I'm going to turn these off just for calculating purposes, is the fact that I never showed you the water tread. Now, if we go back here, we can see here's the water tread. I have that placed right under the beauty pass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first bring the opacity down pretty low. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blur it a little. So I'm going to do a Gaussian blur. Just a little bit of blur. And now I'm going to add a tint. So I'm going to do operation, color correction, tint, and let's go with a little blue here, and we'll color correct that. And I'll probably bring operation, color correct, brightness, contrast, and bring the brightness down a little bit. So you can hardly see it, but it is there. So let's go all the way through here. Maybe we can bring it up like that, and then we can come in here and adjust the opacity again. So bring it up, and it's so subtle, but there is something there. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on compositing. I'm going to have a whole bunch of other ones out, which would include green screen, shooting for green screen. If you have any questions, you can contact me at mskonicki@gmail.com. And I really hope this opens up opportunities to get started. I know there's been a lot of tutorials out about compositing and so forth, but not too many covering the process of actually going from shooting on HD and then going back. So I wish you guys the best, and happy compositing.